questions and the tough questions are asked. But and so he was the chair of that ordination committee. Now, I prepared maybe 10 pages, 10-page document, went doctrine by doctrine. This is what I believe. So that the pastors that were there, so that the chair could properly assess my belief. I mean, after all, they're signing off. I mean, they're saying, okay, we've licensed this guy to preach, but now we're going to ordain him and give him all the rights and privileges thereto of representing Orthodox Christian doctrine. So we want to hear it, and we want to hear him not just say it, we want to hear him defend it. Now, you could have your own personal doctrinal statement, just like your church has its own articles of faith, or your denomination has its articles of faith. But when we talk about worldview, we're talking about something similar, but then categorically and altogether different, because a doctrinal statement really articulates things that you believe, but not necessarily things that govern your life. Did I say that? Now wait a minute. Remember at the outset I said there's all kinds of things that we believe, but do those rise to a level of commitment so that they impact our thinking and our responses? And I'm not sure, but doctrine should be right here. And so if we say, okay, there's worldview, that informs my thought process, but what informs your worldview? Right? What informs your worldview? So there's one more layer up there. And that layer is doctrine. And then we could say, well, I have to go down like this. What informs doctrine? Hello, God's Word. So somehow you draw a big circle around the whole thing, and that's like the Holy Spirit encompassing the whole thing. Helping us to understand, helping our feeble attempts to reason through things. But this is where worldview is so critical. Anyway, I'm going on and on and on about this. Let's get to God's existence and attributes. After all, we have a mighty God, creator God. And let me just give you one little illustration of something significant that should be worth the cost of showing up today, right? I have my Bible open to Genesis 1, verse 1, like this, right after the here's how we translated it, and here's the table of contents, so on and so forth. Here you go, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning. Great. So it'd be really interesting now as we continue. It's very thin pages. Page 2, page 3, page 8. Okay, so I am fascinated by the fact that God created. Now, who is this God? How did He create? I want to know all about creation, please. And so I would imagine that, maybe the first, this much, up to page 86, the first 100 pages anyway, because creation is such an awesome thing. Origins, cosmology. How did everything come into being? How did God actually do it? I want to know about the grandeur and the magnificence of creation. Tell me all about it, Bible. It looks like it's both sides of the first page. So let me tell you something, and you never forget this. This is everything God has to say about creation. Maybe not everything, there's other stuff in the Bible. I get that. But on balance, right here, one page. You know what the rest of this is? Redemption. Redemption. Why do I say that? Whatever's going on in your life, whatever you're facing, keep in mind that on balance, He's a creator God. Oh, that's His mighty power, to be sure. But His power is expressed nonetheless in His act of redemption. So here you go. The rest of the Bible is all God in pursuit of wayward sinners to redeem them and to bring them into a relationship with Himself. So that's His plan for you, by the way. Origin, meaning, morality, destiny. All governed by what? A redeemer, God, a redeemer. Redeemer, somebody that will pay the price to buy back something that's fallen into the wrong hands, something that's become lost to someone else's possession. I'll buy it back. I'll go to the ends of the earth, whatever it takes to buy it back. It's incredible. So anyway, God's existence and attributes. Doug, get on with it. When are you going to get to it? Let me take you back to 1855. It's January the 7th, 1855. Charles Spurgeon, young pastor of New Park Street Chapel in Southwark, England, began his morning sermon with these words that reflected his attitude towards the given subject of the day, right? The highest science, this is Spurgeon, the highest science, the loftiest speculation, the mightiest philosophy which can ever engage the attention of the child of God is the name, the nature, the person, the work, the doings, and the existence of the great God whom he calls Father. It is a subject so vast that all our thoughts are lost in its immensity, so deep that our pride is drowned in its infinity. But while the subject humbles the mind, it also expands it. And nothing will so enlarge the intellect, nothing so magnify the whole soul of man as a devout, earnest, continued investigation of the great subject of God. And while humbling and expanding, this subject is eminently consolatory. We don't use that word a lot. There is nothing which can so comfort the soul, Spurgeon says, so calm the swelling billows of sorrow and grief, so speak peace to the winds of trial, as a devout musing upon the subject of the Godhead. That's J.I. Packer in Knowing God, quoting Spurgeon from 1855. So we're going to look at the existence of God, the fact of God's existence, the mode of God's existence, the nature of God's existence, and this would be relative to the attributes of God, which are both communicable and incommunicable, and then some attempt to apply it. So we'll move along fairly quickly, but just the warning, there are some words here that could throw us, but that's okay. That's okay. Again, we're giving the broad brush strokes. I have to get my mouth working. Broad brush strokes. So the existence of God, the fact of God's existence. So the Bible doesn't, we just read it, in the beginning God, but the Bible does not argue, the existence of God, but merely affirms that God exists. That's Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1. The acceptance of God's existence is linked to faith. That's Hebrews chapter 11. And in verse 3, and the rejection of God's existence is linked to folly. The fool has said in his heart, no God. That's Psalm 14 and verse 1. So this has led critics of theism. So if that's a new term, you'll see it in Sire. But theism, a belief in the existence of God. But theism in terms of monotheism, belief in one God. So this had led critics of theism to identify such faith as based upon subjective grounds. That is, the critics, subjective grounds, lacking convincing evidence and contrary to the scruples of human reason. This, however, is not the case, for God has made himself known in objective terms and given mankind the subjective capacity for receiving the knowledge of his existence. Okay, just threw that out at you. Objective and subjective. Objective means something external to me, something that is observable, but yet is external to me. So some type of a phenomenon or phenomena, observable phenomena. This is all external to me. And then I have the subjective capacity to what? Think about it and reason about it and discern the nature of that objective reality, whatever that is. So for example, the material world is the express work of its creator. and as such is tangible evidence for the existence of God. That's Psalm 19:1, Romans 1:19 and 20. Number 2, the Bible itself is the written revelation of God. So this is objective because it is external to me. It's print on a page, it's revelation, and I can think about it, okay, subjectively, and God has given me that capacity. But the Bible itself is a written revelation of God, whose inspired character and enduring preservation testifies to the existence of the author. That's Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 8, Matthew chapter 24 verse 35, 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 16, 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 23. Aren't you glad this is on video? Because you can hit the pause button and go back and write those down. 3, the incarnate Son of God. We're still talking about what? Objective evidence for God's existence. The incarnate Son of God is the apex, the top of man's evidence for the existence of God. That's John chapter 1 and verse 14, Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 3, 1 John chapter 1 verses 1 through 3. So some have devised rational proofs for the existence of God. This is namely Thomas Aquinas, and he devised 5 of them, or Anselm of Canterbury devised what's called the ontological approach, and so forth and so forth. But these are rational proofs. They can be a priori or a posteriori. A priori are things that are just understood. Like 2 plus 2 is 4. Can we prove that? No, but it's just understood. It is self-evident. A priori types of things are self-evident. A posteriori are based on observable phenomena from which we interact, we can investigate, we can draw conclusions. And so rational proofs then involve really both of those categories, a priori, a posteriori. Don't worry about those terms. But rational proofs say, give me something that is discernible to the human mind such that I can process it and do it in a proper way. That is, use my reason by the rules of logic to derive certain conclusions. They can be inductive or deductive. Deductive to 100% of certainty. Inductive to some range of certainty. Something like that. And that's generally how we think. And what are some of those? Well, there's the cosmological argument. That is, that the universe requires a necessary being or cause, a prime mover, a first mover. So, for example, if you enter into a room and you see like people that would set up all these dominoes and thousands of them in a configuration, and then, boop, somebody hits the first one and they begin to fall. Well, let's say you come into the room and you're observing it, certainly, but you're observing it mid-fall. Everything is, in process of falling. What is your assumption? What is your assumption from that observation? So this is observable phenomenon, these falling dominoes. What is your assumption walking into the room and seeing that? Is your assumption that, these have just been falling forever and ever and ever and ever and ever? This is just an infinite regression of falling. No, you're going to assume that there must have been a first mover, a first cause, a prime mover, something like this. So that's part of the cosmological. It's interesting, and there are many forms of the cosmological argument. But in this case, when you look at the closed system, which is the entire universe, which is a series of cause and effect events, then like those dominoes, it couldn't just be, going forever. There must be a first mover, a first cause, and that being God who set it in motion. There's the teleological argument, or the argument from design. The universe is a complex whole consisting of parts that interact together to achieve an end. So things are purposeful. Origin, meaning, morality, destiny. What's the meaning? What's the purpose behind it? And if you have some purpose, some telos, some goal, some intention, it requires somebody outside the system who intended it, and intended it from the first, from the beginning. The anthropological argument: mankind possesses a moral impulse, an innate voice of conscience, and so on. So origin meaning morality, destiny. So morality being an effective proof of these. As people say, well, no, actually, on evolution and the evolutionary model, morality is just some construct created by human beings for the purpose of survival. We don't murder because then how are we going to survive? So on and so on. It's basically human preferences derived over, generations and generations and generations. But that doesn't answer the ultimate question of morality. The ultimate question of reality is not what is the right action to take, what is the wrong action to take, but where did the whole concept of right and wrong, what makes something right? It's one thing to say that human beings have the capacity to know right and wrong, but it's another thing to say where did rightness and wrongness come from if there isn't some supreme arbiter, some supreme adjudicator of not only truth, but what is right, what is wrong in the absolute sense? Who makes it right? And so you'll work at a particular job, and I'm sure there are do's and don'ts, on that job. And not only your job description, but, don't take company property home with you. Don't, there's all of these policies and things of that nature, okay? And you'd say, then it would be right to do what the policy says. It would be wrong, but right or wrong can't be legislated, right? Somebody has to be the ultimate arbiter. What makes that right? So don't take company property home. Don't steal. Okay, so I shouldn't steal. But who said stealing is wrong? Really? Is it wrong? So you get where I'm going with this. I don't get in the weeds on it. But the anthropological, the moral argument, the ontological argument is really, out there. It's really tough, not for everybody. Alvin Plantinga, who would be a professor at Notre Dame and has sort of revived the ontological argument. William Lane Craig to some extent, but he usually falls to the Kalam cosmological argument. Anselm of Canterbury. Okay, he was the one that has best articulated. Nobody really has outdone Anselm of Canterbury in articulating the ontological. I happen to like the ontological argument, but it is a priori. See, the a posteriori arguments are easier to understand, although they're difficult, but easier to understand, easier to articulate, because they're based on sense experience and they're based on observable phenomena and rendering conclusions from what you see in personal experience. A priori is basically just something that is apart from sense experience. It is like a thought experiment. And so Anselm took 14:1 of Psalms that said, the fool has said in his heart, no God. And he took that and said, well, wait a minute. So the fool who denies the existence of God, but he does so when in his mind he has the concept of God. So in other words, he has to begin with the concept of God to then deny the existence of God. Where did that concept of God come from? And Anselm, extrapolated this into a view, and he called it the greatest of all possible beings. I can't do justice to it here, and I won't attempt to, but I think you can get the sense of it, in that Anselm is saying, then, the greatest of all possible beings. There must be in a whole taxonomy of ontology, ontos meaning being, ontology meaning the whole discussion of being, human beings, inanimate object, everything that exists, whatever has being. But there must be a greatest possible being. And so it certainly wouldn't just be a superhuman, because we have a lifespan, that's it, whatever. So there must be some being that is not subject to time, space, and matter. What would be the most ultimate expression of being? That would be the greatest of all possible beings. But if the greatest of all possible beings only exists as a mental concept, then there must be a greater possibility, or a greater, possible being that exists in reality. I think it's a great argument, I do. So, on the lips of someone who says, God doesn't exist, where'd you get the concept of God from? This concept, this mental image planted in your mind. Interesting. Okay, so the mode of God's existence. The word Trinity does not appear in the Bible. It represents the triunity, the 3-in-1 mode of God's existence. It's taught in the Bible, three in one. The teaching may be observed as follows. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew word Elohim is plural, though translated as the singular God. For example, Genesis 1:1. You could say, though, it's not a reference to a plurality within the Godhead, but it's a plural of majesty. You could say it that way. But then God himself is recorded as speaking with reference to a plurality of persons in the unit. Let us make man in our image, for example, Genesis 1:26, or Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 8, and Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4. And then the New Testament declares that the Father is God, Romans 1:7. The Son is God, Hebrews chapter 1 in verse 8, and the Spirit is God, Acts chapter 5, verses 3 and 4, but affirms at the same time that there is only one God, Romans chapter 3 and verse 30, Galatians chapter 3 and verse 20, and 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 5. Let's talk about the nature of God's existence. So while atheists categorically deny the existence of God, agnostics deny that it's possible for man to know if God exists. But theists, on the other hand, affirm that the nature of God's existence is such that he is incomprehensible to man, but yet knowable by man. So in other words, God is incomprehensible in that his nature cannot be fully understood. You know, the secret things belong to the Lord. Remember this from Deuteronomy 29:29. God makes himself known, but certainly not fully known. He exists ontologically other. We call that the transcendence of God. He is ontologically other than we are. And so we must be careful not to just accommodate the grandeur of God to purely human, rational categories. There's Job chapter 11 and verse 7. There's Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. I told you we were going to be getting a little deeper in this, so I apologize. Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. Romans chapter 11 and verse 33. So a myriad of cults deny this statement and subject the nature of God to the limits of human understanding. And this is what happens, whether Mormon, whether Jehovah's Witness, whatever the cult is that is not orthodox, okay, whatever that is, deny the deity of Jesus, is basically on the limits of human understanding because, and keep in mind, God is ontologically distinct, other than his creation, separate from